What's up, everybody? You're listening to the Baseline Scoop, talking about everything past, present, and future about your Philadelphia 76ers. I'm your host, Zach Ciavolella. Thank you so much for joining us again for our second ever episode. If you haven't yet, check out PhillySportsNetwork.com and all the other podcasts on PSN Radio for even more brilliant Philly sports coverage. Well, moving on to the Sixers today, we're going to be discussing the ripple effect stemming from the Chicago Bulls hiring Billy Donovan. Now, Donovan was one of the prime candidates for the Sixers' vacant head coaching position, along with Tyronn Lue and Mike D'Antoni. All three actually were scheduled at one point for interviews this week for the position with the Sixers. Donovan quickly decided that the Bulls were the right team for him. Why, though? Why exactly the Bulls? Why the Bulls instead of the Sixers, assuming the Sixers were, in fact, interested? In my opinion, Donovan is the number one choice of those three. Did the Sixers not feel the same? Did it not matter? Why exactly? So, the Bulls obviously have plenty of young depth, but, really, they only have one all-star caliber player. While the Sixers, they have one superstar and one fringe superstar. As far as I can see, there are three reasons why Donovan may have made that choice. Now, the first is, honestly, in my opinion, the most likely. Donovan believes in the Bulls' youth, and he believes in their cap flexibility. Now, what I specifically mean by that is, when you look at the way the Bulls team is constructed, you look at the players who most likely will play a long-term role. Obviously, that starts with Zach LaVine, and shortly thereafter, Lauri Markkanen. Zach LaVine is, in my opinion, absolutely a star. He just needs the right supporting cast and head coach in order to show the wins that are needed to kind of reflect that reputation. He's a little bit short of Devin Booker in my book. No pun intended. So really, he is will be a full-fledged star once the Bulls figure this out. Lauri Markkanen, one of the up-and-coming stretch bigs. I think that he has all-star potential. I put him a little bit above Domantas Sabonis level. They're not similar players, just more so that he'll get an all-star nomination, maybe two. I think he'll be a very good player for a long time. I don't think he's quite a superstar, but still an important piece. Outside of that, you have Wendell Carter Jr., who looks to be the future at center for the Chicago Bulls. Just a nice role player in the sense that he plays defense, he gets rebounds, he does what you need him to do. Finally, Kobe White, who they drafted last season. He is, kind of caught between a point guard and a shooting guard. I like him no matter what position you play him at. The guy can absolutely score just out of his mind. So it really bodes well for the future of Chicago, and it makes sense from a talent standpoint why D'Antoni why Billy Donovan would find the appeal in Chicago, and then on the other hand, there's their cap flexibility. So between Otto Porter, Tomas Satoransky, and Thaddeus Young, three players who we will talk about a little later in the show, they have roughly $50 million, even more, being freed up after this season in what will be one of the most coveted free agency classes in recent memory. So Chicago, especially the market that Chicago is, they have the opportunity to really form something special based on the talent they have, the youth that they have, the money that they will have. It is a good situation. Now, the Sixers may be a little more win now, but if Donovan wants to stick around and help build this team, I can't blame him for that. The second reason I could see, just a straight-up lack of controversy. The Chicago Bulls, yes, they're not the Bulls that they were under Jordan or even Derrick Rose, but they are not under the scrutiny of the public eye in the same way that the Sixers are. The Sixers are being really just analyzed at every turn. They are constantly in the middle of rumors about really everyone thinking that the right thing to do is to blow it up and split up the two stars, Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons, when that is absolutely insane. All the inner office turmoil, they certainly didn't help themselves with how they handled the firing of Brett Brown. I can understand from that point of view as well why Donovan would not want to come. I cannot blame him at all, considering the way that the front office has handled themselves. But thirdly, yeah, I really do think that this also may have played a part in it, unfortunately, and that is that the Sixers wouldn't loosen the purse strings. Donovan was one of the top free agent head coaches, and he was going to demand a hefty payday. Something that you can't blame him for. It's something to be expected for the top free agent in any aspect. So it wouldn't be surprising if Donovan went for, say, $7, $8, $9 million a year. If the Sixers struggled to justify paying that for a head coach, considering all the money they still have tied up into Brett Brown, which is nobody's fault but their own, but they don't like to bring up that part. So, in any case, no matter, the Sixers list of candidates drops by one. By all reports, the two leaders for the job are Tyronn Lue and Mike D'Antoni. By no means do I say that as a form of encouragement. Both of these candidates, I believe, will only bring more mediocrity. If you're telling me that those are my two options, I am begrudgingly going with Mike D'Antoni. But that's only after having a long, perfectly frank discussion with him that the team will not trade Joel Embiid. Now, Tyronn Lue is a head coach. He was barely that. I've said it many times before. He was a figurehead in Cleveland. LeBron James was the head coach for that team. He's the one who coached that team on the championship run. Lue had little, if anything, to do with that. Lue, in fact, he's a net neutral. He doesn't necessarily make your team worse. He certainly does not make their team better. Mike D'Antoni, meanwhile, well, frankly, it could be as bad. He may come in and completely destroy this team's chance at success. Now, he's heralded by many as an offensive genius. D'Antoni would attempt to coach the team most likely from what their natural focus should be, and that's defense. There is a way that D'Antoni can come in, and it can, I can't believe I'm even saying this, but it can even work out for the Sixers. But back to their natural focus defense. Joel Embiid, Ben Simmons, okay, they are both, and they will be, perennial contenders for Defensive Player of the Year, NBA Defensive First Team. They're going to be around that conversation for a long time, especially when the NBA wisens up that Rudy Gobert is not as good as they think. Matisse Thybulle, who so far he seems to be a building block. It could be a trade piece, but personally I'm hoping that he's around for the long haul. He's already on his way to being one of the best perimeter defenders in the entire NBA. So really, if you focus on building up that side of the ball, adding in other contributors who can stiffen up that defense, we couldn't stop any of the Boston Celtics. Even, Brad Wanamaker was getting open shots when he wanted them. You need defenders, especially come playoff time. Now, with D'Antoni, we know that's not his usual MO. So really, if you can coach up that defense with an assistant coach, kind of a defensive specialist, really like what Ime Udoka was supposed to be last season, then you might be onto something. Now, I'm not advocating for Udoka himself. It did not go well last season, to say the least. He is likely a head coaching candidate for still a few teams that are looking around, and I wish him the best of luck. Maybe he latches on as assistant somewhere else, but I really don't have any interest in keeping him around based on what I saw out of this defense last season. That was his task, and I feel like he didn't deliver. So, really, if you do get a defensive specialist for an assistant coach in here, someone who can build up that defense, let D'Antoni worry about the offense, and Elton Brand fill the team with shooters. I think that there's a slim chance he goes with this strategy, but it certainly is the right one, if you ask me. adding players like Justin Holiday, Marco Bellinelli, someone D'Antoni's very familiar with in Austin Rivers. These players, especially Justin Holiday, who's a very underrated player, these are the kind of players that you're going to need to add to this team. Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons. It's been said for so long by so many people that what you need to do is add shooting. It's so obvious. The Sixers haven't done it. I can't tell you why. They haven't done it. They did it a little bit when they added Ilyasova, Marco Bellinelli when he was here, and we had J.J. Redick. And we saw what that team looked like. That team was absolutely incredible. Why we got away from that? I can't figure it out. I still can't. I'm still at a loss for it. But the team needs to go back to Joel Embiid, Ben Simmons, and shooters, and then just call it a day. We have some young shooters for Ken Korkmaz, Shake Milton. Both seem to be nice pieces, off the bench going forward. Tobias Harris allegedly is a good shooter. Yet to really see that in a Sixers uniform, but that tends to happen when we add players. They just forget how to shoot. Markelle Fultz. So, really, when we're worrying about this team, it's those kind of players, Bellinelli's, the Rivers, but really who I'm looking at are players like Justin Holiday, who can play a little bit of that two-way ball, who, yes, they can stroke the three, but they can also defend. One thing that we need absolutely are wing defenders. So if you can get that best of both worlds, absolutely. At the very least, adding those shooters, Langston Galloways of the world, and they're all cheap. That's the other thing, is that all these players are going to be affordable for the Sixers. That's why none of these names are overwhelming. I'm not mentioning Joe Harris, players like that, because frankly, the Sixers just cannot afford them. So you need to be realistic, and you need to add the right quality of player, because you don't have a lot of money to play with. So really, that's the only way that I see Mike D'Antoni working well with the Sixers. There are... Hopefully D'Antoni, again, in my opinion, is not the head coach of the Sixers. But it's looking that way thanks to really just a ripple effect of the Chicago Bulls signing Billy Donovan. Now, that is not the only potential side effect of Chicago signing Donovan. We are going to take a short break, and then when we come back, we are going to talk a little bit more about, well, I'll leave it as a surprise, but one of the other side effects of this Donovan signing.
Took a minute to find my way, but the blessings I see make me glad for mistakes. I'm learning, not wasting my time.
All right, welcome back to the Baseline Scoop. Before our break, we talked about the Bulls signing Billy Donovan and just how exactly that affected the Sixers' hunt for a new head coach. Well, now it's time that we talk about another potential side effect, and that is Al Horford. Yes, the same Al Horford who embezzled the city of Philadelphia for over $100 million straight Dr. Evil style. So what does Al Horford have to do with the Chicago Bulls? Well, I am glad that you asked, listener. The Chicago Bulls have suddenly become a new potential home for Al Horford. Now, I want to make sure I give credit. Lucas Johnson of the Sixers Sense suggested in a recent article that the Chicago Bulls are now a legitimate destination for Al Horford. Now, I suggest that you go read that article if you want his perspective and, really on the reason why behind this opinion. But from my point of view, it makes sense for two reasons. First, really the most straightforward, Billy Donovan coached Al Horford at the University of Florida. They even won a national championship together. It would make sense that, a position of need, a player who, contrary to most Sixers fans, can still provide something to the team. And again, one that's familiar to him, it makes sense that Donovan would want to reunite with him while Donovan was coaching in the University of Florida. They did win a national championship. They found success together. Al Horford has been a stand-up player for most, if not all, his entire career. Really just somebody that you want in the locker room. Again, we didn't see a lot of this last season. It was a little bit of a tough spot, to be fair to Horford. So it makes sense. Now, the second and probably the most important thing is that the Chicago Bulls, like the Sixers, they're facing a critical crossroad this season. Now, last year, multiple Bulls voiced their frustrations about the direction of the team, namely their two primary stars, Zach LaVine and Lauri Markkanen. Now, if this team does not become more competitive, and soon, the Bulls are just going to have two fresh trade demands on their hands. So, with that in mind, the Bulls should be very active, especially in the trade market, considering that they are flexible financially. The future of the NBA salary cap situation is a little murky. So really, with their expiring contracts and their young players, securing quality players through the trade market is definitely something that the Bulls should be interested in. So while they kind of have that set up, if you want to win now, you got to wait next year if you want to go to next year's free agent class. This year's free agent class, it's not going to move the chip. It's not going to do anything. So in steps Al Horford. The Bulls are extremely young at center. And while the future is bright with Wendell Carter Jr., a stopgap would certainly help, especially a cheap one. And when I say cheap, we all know Al Horford isn't cheap. But he's not going to cost too much in terms of assets. Okay? So when you look at who the Bulls may be willing to part with, and again, this is while keeping salary in mind because it has to match up. Otto Porter is kind of the name that screams out. He's making roughly $28 million this year on an expiring deal. He'd be a great fit. He's a 3-and-D forward, can kind of play combo forward. I think Tobias Harris, like many, is really a power forward, not a small forward. Otto Porter is typically a small forward, not a power forward. That works out great, where you can have them play whatever position they're comfortable with. And really, it just helps add shooting to your team, adds defense to your team. There's no real downside to adding Otto Porter. If there is a way to trade Horford for Porter, I am all for it. I just don't see it happening without the Sixers adding a first-round pick or a young player like a Shake Milton, who at this point, unless it's a heck of a deal, I'm just unwilling to part with. What would make more sense for both teams is sending over Horford for Thaddeus Young and Tomas Satoransky. Young, very familiar name. He spent 7 years with the Sixers. He would be returning to where it all began. He saw his best years in a Sixers uniform. Now, the Bulls are likely eager to part with him, considering that he and their star, Lauri Markkanen, they didn't really see eye to eye. Last season, they were in a constant battle for playing time. Then head coach Jim Boylan, he caved to Young and kind of seemed to put Markkanen over the edge by doing so. It really just was not a pretty situation for all parties considered. Chicago will be moving on from Thaddeus Young one way or another. I firmly believe that. But it's just a matter of will it be with Young coming back to Philadelphia, which I would certainly welcome. He could fill either likely a bench role or even a spotting role or starting role rather with the Sixers, depending on how the rest of the roster shapes up. Now, if you decide to stick with Ben Simmons at the 4, obviously Thaddeus Young's not starting over Simmons, but he would be an absolute quality backup to Simmons if that is the case. If Harris is moved to power forward, again, great backup. Thaddeus Young, he's played a lot of small forward in his career. Those days are done. He is pretty much strictly a power forward now. He can stretch the field a little bit, but he's really there for his leadership, his activity, and every once in a while his shot. But seeing Thaddeus Young back in a Sixers uniform, I'm all behind it, especially if it means moving on from Al Horford's deal. One of the most important things about Young is, again, that his deal is expiring after this upcoming season. So moving on to Tomas Satoransky, he is big guard, about 6'7", and typically he's a shooter. And when I tell you he can shoot, he can shoot. Now, again, typically, he only shot 32% from three last season, but he's a career 37% shooter from deep. I'm not worried about him long term. I really think he's going to bounce back. The Bulls last season were an absolute mess. Very few players came out. Very few of anyone in the entire organization came out looking that good by the end of it. So I think Satoransky can get back on track. Again, players tend to forget how to shoot when they come to the Sixers, but if they already forgot how to shoot, it can't get much worse. So I really do think that under, assumably, Mike D'Antoni, that Satoransky could be a quality addition. And again, he's also on an expiring deal. Another thing to mention is that, while he's 6'7", he's played a few different positions in his time in the NBA. He is capable enough to play the point. So he could be either your backup to Ben Simmons. You could start him. I think he's more of a bench talent on a contending team. But again, you want to put guys that fit Simmons and Embiid in the starting lineup. So he certainly would be a better fit offensively than, say, Josh Richardson. So you could insert him if you're going to play Ben at the 1. You could insert Satoransky at the 2. If Ben is playing literally any other position, then Satoransky could play the point guard. So that's kind of the nice thing about his versatility. But he really is just a nice, capable passer who can take a little bit of the pressure off of Ben Simmons, something that is much needed no matter who you're looking at. We're going to need that if it's free agency. If it's the draft, sure, that player probably won't be ready to step into that big of a role. Or if it's the trade market like this. Either way, really, it's a quality that we're going to need. So, really, in the final part of this deal, if I'm Philly, I'm asking the Bulls for their young center, Daniel Gafford. Gafford is young, he's athletic, albeit raw, but he could be a great quality backup for Joel Embiid. Right now, he's not much more than a shot blocker or rim runner, but he really has the potential to be a solid and cheap backup for years to come. Think a lot of JaVale McGee, just with, I think, with a higher basketball IQ, which is really kind of seemed like the thing that McGee was missing. So I think that Gafford has legitimate potential. I think that when he reaches his potential, it will be a starting quality center. So if you can add him to the Sixers roster and build him up, especially while he's only making roughly $1 million a year, $1.5 million, definitely why not? You make the trade for Gafford, you then sign a veteran in free agency, someone like a Jan Mahimi, really just someone who re-signed Kylo Quinn. It's an option. I kind of want to sign somebody who can produce a little bit more because, again, Gafford is young. Making this trade and adding him as a piece, it's a little bit of a future move. He will certainly be able to add something to the team this upcoming season, but it's going to take time, and the team and the fans would have to be patient with him. So adding someone who can legitimately play, a veteran that is, and then having Gafford, I think is the right way to go. Now, if you add all three of those players to the deal simply for Horford, it's probably not going to get it done. I don't think you're that far off. So really, you're talking about a matter of maybe you add in a cheap young player, maybe you add in draft compensation. I would prefer to trade the draft compensation. The Sixers have 5 second-round picks. I certainly say that Al Horford and the 34th overall pick in this draft, I think that's enough to get it done for both teams, and I just think it makes too much sense for both sides not to consider. So, really, that's the highlight of the Billy Donovan signing. You know, the Sixers, they lost a coaching candidate, but hopefully they found a trade partner. Okay, so really, time's going to tell. I can't say that they benefited from missing out on Donovan, or at least that they came out on top in that decision, but maybe there is some beneficial news to come with Donovan going to Chicago. So really, those are the two biggest ramifications of Donovan signing in Chicago. The Sixers are still on the hunt for a head coach. My vote is still for Toronto Raptors assistant head coach Adrian Griffin. Like I said earlier, the Sixers should have a defensive focus going forward, and Griffin could certainly bring that. Mike D'Antoni, well, not so much. So we'll see. My prediction as of right now is that D'Antoni will end up getting the job, especially after this Donovan signing. So hopefully he finds that assistant coach who will add that defensive side to the game, and they can build the roster without sacrificing crucial pieces like Ben Simmons or more likely Joel Embiid. But anyway, that's all for us today. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check out PhillySportsNetwork.com and all the other podcasts on PSN Radio. Shoot me a follow on Twitter at ZCIAVOPSN, and you can follow the show at baseline_scoop. But for now, this has been Zach Ciavolella hitting you with the Baseline Scoop.